One of your rights when you're arrested is the right to counsel. Several hundred of those have been on the list for over a year. 700 more for 6 months. 700 more for 5 months. About 1,000 more for 4 months. So
2 weeks ago, Cole County Circuit Court Judge William Hickle issued a ruling that could have a big impact on the state of Missouri and its criminal justice system. Joining us today to talk about what happened and what needs to happen next is Tony Rothert. He's the legal director of the ACLU of Missouri. Tony, welcome back.
Good to be here.
So the ACLU of Missouri filed this lawsuit in this case almost exactly a year ago. What were the main allegations that you were making?
So this lawsuit, which we filed together with the MacArthur Justice Center a year ago, was challenging the state public defender's use of waiting lists as a way of trying to deal with the backlog of cases that they had and the overworkedness of their attorneys.
And help us understand the magnitude of this problem. At its peak, how many people were on this waiting list and how long were they stuck on this waiting list?
It was bad. Thousands of people were on the waiting list. Waiting lists were being used in about a quarter of the counties. 29 Missouri counties had waiting lists. Even as it improved, there are still people on waiting lists for a long time. So, November 2019, for instance, there were 5,800 people on waiting lists across the state.
So I'd love to give people a sense of what it means to be on one of these waiting lists. I mean, in many cases, these people are in jail. You guys had one of the plaintiffs in your case. He kept coming up. His court dates were coming up, and he was there in court without any attorney to help him. How does that work?
Yeah. Well, it's not how it's supposed to work. One of the plaintiffs, he had showed up for a bail hearing while 7 times without a lawyer while he was on the waiting list.
7 times.
He was entitled to an attorney 7 different times he went to court. And guess what? His bail was reduced 0 of those times. After he had been on the waiting list for almost 6 months, and he had an attorney join his case, then he was out within 2 days. His bail was reduced. So, he stayed in jail for almost 6 months because he was on the waiting list.
And in this lawsuit, you're arguing that this isn't just a bad thing, that this is something that's unconstitutional. Why is that? Right.
So, as everyone who has watched any police procedural show knows, one of your rights when you're arrested is the right to counsel. And when the state is seeking to put someone in prison, they have a constitutional right to have an attorney with them and representing them. And that's not happening. In Missouri, it wasn't happening before waiting lists. Waiting lists are the latest symptom of the underfunded system of providing counsel for criminal defendants that the Constitution requires.
And these waiting lists, my understanding is the Public Defender's Office has been using them now since 2017. Is that right?
Yes, since 2017. And in their defense, the judges are concurring in the use of the waiting list, and the legislature, passed a law that authorizes them. So they are trying to follow a statute to solve their caseload issues, and judges are in a predicament when competent counsel can't be provided, and so both judges and the Public Defender's Office are, looking at the statute and saying, well, the legislature said we could do this. So the real problem here is that law is unconstitutional, at least as it's being used here.
And so, you brought this lawsuit asking the judge to find this to be unconstitutional, and he did rule for you. What did he find in this ruling?
Well, he said that we would win. the way this is set up is unconstitutional. That it started in 2017. It continues today. Back in 2019, there were 5,800 cases on the waiting list. Mm-hmm. We had a trial in November where we got updated numbers, and even then, in November, it had shrunk, but it was 2,500 people statewide on the list, and several hundred of those had been on the list for over a year. 700 more for 6 months, 700 more for 5 months, about 1,000 more for 4 months. So, it was happening and it continued. And he found that we're likely to show that it violates the state constitutional guarantee of the right to counsel, because you have a right to have an attorney within a reasonable amount of time after you've been charged.
So his ruling, I can't say I was shocked that he would find that this was unconstitutional, but something I found really interesting in this ruling is how he honed in on the idea that you need to get a lawyer within 2 weeks. He felt that was really important. What was his thinking on that?
Well, right, and that's part of the problem with waiting lists is it doesn't do you. It's not good enough to get a lawyer a year later or 6 months later, and it's not just having to go to bond hearings without representation. It's that there are certain decisions that have to be made quickly, or you lose them, like the right to ask for a change of judge, which you have in Missouri. If 30 days passes, you've lost that right. That can make the entire difference of the case, or a change of venue. But in any case, investigating the facts, starting to build the case, communicating with the defendant, that has to be timely done. Otherwise, it loses its value. So if attorney's not even thinking about the case, much less trying to talk to a witness or trying to get documents saved or videos saved until 3-4 months later, the evidence could be gone. And then that affects how the case turns out.
So Judge Hickle, he found this unconstitutional, or said he was likely to eventually rule that this was unconstitutional. What is the remedy now that we know that this doesn't pass muster? Well,
that's the hard part, and I think it's the part the judge is struggling with, what to do about it. And so for now, he has stayed his opinion and said, I'm going to find this unconstitutional, but really we need an enduring solution, and that needs to come from the legislature. And he harkened back to 1971. In the 60s and the very beginning of the 70s, Missouri just didn't provide counsel to indigent defendants. The U.S. Supreme Court said, "Oh, you have to." But there was no immediate legislative response. So what happened is, in different courts would appoint a lawyer and say, "You have to represent them for free." And some of this is in ACLU archives more than in court decisions, but there were some challenges to that by lawyers who said that you're forcing me to do these services, and that costs me money, and you're not paying me. So the Missouri Supreme Court, found that whole scheme of appointing people without paying them was a skirting of the state's responsibility to provide counsel, and said it was unconstitutional, but recognizing the permanent solution would be better, gave some time to the General Assembly to fix it. And that is what led to the creation of the Missouri Public Defender System in 1972. Since then, at least for the last 2 decades, the Missouri public defender system has not received much increase in funding. But we have increased the number of people we're prosecuting and trying to put in jail. So both the lack of keeping up so that staff can be hired, lack of having the money in from the legislature, and the legislative choice and prosecutors' choices to prosecute more and more crimes and put more and more people in prison have combined to make public defender workloads so incapable of being handled that there's burnout, there's high turnover, there are ethical complaints and ethical problems because attorneys cannot provide competent defense, and there are defendants not getting competent defense as well. So, the waiting list is really just a symptom of that. It's one of the ways the legislature, rather than putting up money, tried to give an out to give some relief to public defenders without giving them any more money, and it doesn't work because it's at the expense of defendants' constitutional rights.
Okay. So Judge Hickle is now saying the legislature needs to step up, and that leads us to our next guest. I should note we've been talking to Tony Rothert. He's the legal director of the ACLU of Missouri, and joining us now is State Representative Tony Lovasco. He's a Republican from O'Fallon, and we're hoping to talk to him about what the legislature might do about this ruling. So Representative Lovasco, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon.
So this public defender funding, as Tony Rothert outlined here, this has been a long-standing problem for the state of Missouri. We're not funding this at the level that judges say we need to be funding it for a constitutional system. Is this something that the Missouri legislature is now talking about?
Well, the mechanics of how the budget works, a lot of that happens not quite behind closed doors, but in very long meetings that you're not likely to want to watch all of. I'm not part of that process directly, but I have been involved in some of the conversations on the outside. I can tell you this is an important issue to me, certainly. I think, regardless of this court hearing, I think it's very clear that we have not been adequately funding the public defender's office for some time. And I think just kind of common sense suggests that when you've got people literally waiting for months to have a lawyer, that, well, you've clearly got a supply and demand issue there that needs to be adjusted. And I think there's really 2 ways that we slice it, and I think we ought to do both. I think we need to look at increasing the funding, and I think we also need to perhaps reduce some of that demand by perhaps revisiting some of our actual laws to see if maybe we ought to be cutting some things from the book so that we aren't prosecuting people for crimes that are not causing harm to others.
So Representative Lovasco, in addition to adding more funding for this office, you'd like to see fewer people being prosecuted in general.
Sure. No, I think, we spend a dramatic amount of taxpayer resources prosecuting people for crimes that are not hurting others. The purpose of government should ultimately be to secure our rights, to protect ourselves, from others, from government, and to make sure that those rights are secure. And it's not to tell us how to live. It's not to try to create a society that we would prefer. Ultimately, government should be regulating harm. And we go so far beyond that in so many ways. And all that does is it increases the burden of the system, it increases the cost of the taxpayer, and ultimately it makes things an awful lot more complicated for everybody.
Do you think your Republican colleagues share your thoughts on that?
I think we're starting to move in that direction. I think the wheel has definitely turned more in favor of criminal justice reform in general. I'm vice chair of the Criminal Justice Committee. Shamid Dogan, a representative from, I believe, Baldwin, has been working on this issue before. I actually was in the legislature. He's the chairman of that committee. And we've looked at an awful lot of issues in the last couple of years, some very small and some very large, that make a big dent, I think, in kind of keeping things in the direction that we want them to go rather than how they've been headed for so many decades.
Tony Rothert, I know this has to be music to your ears.
Well, yes. I mean, I agree on what the role of government is. And, we put particularly, the drug crimes that have no victims are a big group of laws that we put people in prison for violating in this state. And that is being looked at across the country. And Missouri is not, we're not at the forefront in addressing that. But reducing the number of people who need an attorney would also reduce the caseloads.
So beyond this bigger picture issue, though, we have kind of an immediate need right now. And whatever the legislature does, it's hard to imagine it would immediately impact prosecutors and what they're doing in these individual counties. I know earlier this month, Governor Parson recommended the legislature approve a budget increase of $820,000. This is a request from the Missouri State Public Defender's Office. And I'm sorry, I misspoke. I said earlier this month. I meant February. It's already March. Representative Lovasco, do you support that increase?
I do. I don't think that's quite enough, to be honest. I'm not sure that gets us all that far. My numbers are a little bit out of date, but looking at last year's numbers from 2020, I know the department was saying that they were somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 to $8 million behind what they'd like to get. I think the governor had recommended like $1.5 million extra. I don't have all those details. Again, I'm not on budget, but just kind of common sense suggests that, in the scheme of our state budget, that's a pretty small amount of money. I could, just off the top of my head, list a litany of items that we have spent more than that on that I would think are nowhere near as important. I mean, we spent almost $500,000 to clean the statue on the top of the Capitol. I feel like we can do better to make sure that people have their constitutionally, mandated right to counsel.
Tony Rothert, how much money do you think it would take to fix this problem?
Well, it depends. It depends what the problem is that we're trying to fix. I think what the governor has proposed is an excellent step in the right direction, and we have not seen a proposed increase from a Missouri governor in years. So it's positive. It is. I don't think it's enough even to deal with the waiting lists that we have right now. And if it is, the waiting lists will come back because it will be enough to deal with it in the moment, but not on a ongoing basis. And the waiting lists are really just the latest symptom of the overburdened public defender system. Fixing one symptom doesn't make the real problem go away. And the real problem is that the state has, for a long time, neglected this constitutional obligation and hasn't fixed it. So, step in the right direction, but really just a drop in the bucket.
Representative Lovasco, the idea of increasing this even beyond what the governor is asking for, I understand that's not just as simple as saying, hey, let's put this in here. Some sort of trade-off would need to be made. Explain to us how that process works.
Yes, unfortunately, it's very difficult to make major changes in our budget, and for good reason. Basically, any time that you propose an increase in spending in one area, you have to propose a simultaneous cut in spending somewhere else so that we can have a balanced budget, which I think is absolutely important. That's valid. Unfortunately, it kind of puts us in a position where any time that, you might even have consensus that something's important, what's a lot harder to get is consensus on, well, what's less important. Everyone has an advocacy group that they think is most important to them. We all have, come from different parts of the state. That really complicates things. And so while, I may be able to very easily and with no difficulty say that, it's ridiculous to give $3 million to fix up the Truman Presidential Library that we don't even own, that, something like that would be well better spent on the public defender's office. Well, someone who represents that district or that area, who that, brings in a lot of tourism revenue and local tax dollars to their location, well, they have to consider their constituents as well. And so it gets really complicated really quick.
Do you think that's one reason that despite this long history, as Tony Rothert just outlined, this has been a problem for years? Is that why the legislature hasn't addressed this previously? Or is there more of an attitude of, hey, we want to be buttressing prosecutors. We don't want to put more money into public defenders?
I've never seen that attitude. I mean, there's definitely a, very pro-police, pro-prosecutor mentality in the General Assembly, but I've never seen it, come at the expense of people's fundamental rights like that. I've never heard anyone, we don't need those public defenders at all. That's just to represent guilty people. I never heard anything like that. So I really do think it's more just a matter of kind of the process and the sausage making and just the unfortunate it's just been a casualty of just people having priorities that are just more important to them.
So Tony Rothert, put these consequences into focus for us. In light of Judge Hickle's ruling here, what happens if the legislature doesn't address this and doesn't properly fund this system in its next budget?
Judge Hickle's going to have to order something, and what that is, we don't know. He might just say it's unconstitutional, and then all those defendants who are on waiting lists, the judges in their individual cases would have to decide what to do now that the waiting lists are unconstitutional. And it could be setting them free and dismissing charges. Judge Hickle could also order that judges can appoint private attorneys, but because of the 1970 decision of the Missouri Supreme Court, that can't be done without paying them. So, the state would just be ordered to pay and would have to figure out how to come up with money that's not budgeted. So, these aren't, we didn't want him to stay his decision to give the legislature time because legislature has had decades. But the court is right that this is something the legislature needs to take responsibility for, and it's unfortunate that it's falling on this legislature. The neglect for decades is falling on this legislature, especially at a time when revenues could be affected because of COVID, and there's all these unusual expenses. But something has to happen. People's rights are at stake. They're being violated today, and it's something that's happening across the state, and affects it can affect any family at any time.
Well, we intend to stay on this story, and I know you will be staying on top of this too. So, Tony Rothert, legal director for the ACLU of Missouri, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And Representative Tony Lovasco, thank you for giving us some perspective on how this all plays out. It'll be interesting to see what happens next.
Thanks very much.
One quick note before we go. This next week will be marking 1 full year since Missouri Governor Mike Parson declared a state of emergency amid the COVID-19 pandemic. He did that just hours after then President Trump declared the pandemic a national emergency. On March 12, we're planning a special edition of St. Louis on the Air devoted to reflections on the past year. And we'd love to hear yours. What have you found yourself grieving over in recent months? What has brought you joy or strength? Or a different question to ponder, if you like. What's the thing that has surprised you the most during all of this? You can share your reflection by leaving us your first name, where you're calling from, and a brief voicemail. Call 314-516-6397 to leave us your message. Again, that's 314-516-6397. And if you'd prefer to write out your thoughts, you can email talk@stlpublicradio.org. Thanks so much for listening.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.